Now I'd like to welcome to the show Adam Thierer, Senior Fellow at the R Street Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
All right, now, so you've been around tech policy for a long time, and when it comes to how the government regulation regulates technology and implements what we call, quote, tech policy, I think maybe the first question is what counts as technology? So, in recent years, recent decades, the answer has been things like computer networks, various internet applications and websites, new kinds of software, and now we have machine learning tools that we call AI, artificial intelligence. But whenever this comes up and people talk about tech, and this is the tech world, I think, isn't textile engineering and pharmaceutical development and plant breeding and these things are also technology. They're technologies, right? They're what we might call part of technological development and economic growth, but it's not usually what we talk about when we talk about tech policy. That's usually like digital technology. Is there is there some important, meaningful difference that we need to think about when we say, well, tech policy is about digital stuff, and that other science stuff, that's something else.
Yeah, that's a great point, Richard. I often, there's a pet peeve of mine. I'm often talking to other think tank leaders and policy analysts and talking about how the free market movement in particular has mistakenly equated information and communications technology policy with all tech policy. And that's primarily because ICT has become so dominant in modern times. We talk about the information revolution and the internet. And certainly in my lifetime, I've been doing tech policy for 32 years, but I've been doing ICT policy primarily because that's the big game in town, and it's what dominates so much time and attention, both politically and socially, and throughout our society. But you're absolutely right. It means technology policy means so much more. I mean, there are remarkable technological revolutions happening in many, many other fields right now, from medical science to agricultural sciences and environmental and energy sciences. So it's important that we understand this is a much bigger picture set of issues. I will say this, we do live in a world of increasing technological convergence and a blurring of the lines between many of these sectors. And that sort of what's called combinatorial innovation that's happening, sort of multiple technological revolutions reinforcing each other. That is something that makes technology policy a little bit more interesting these days than the old days, where we had strictly segmented silos of our economy and technologies that just simply really did not interact. So that has been a major change, and certainly ICT, information communications technology, has been a major driver.
Well, I guess if you go back and look at what the biggest companies were in, between 1950 and 1975, you know, you had some big ones that were like IBM that ended up becoming kind of ICT giants, but they were more, big manufacturers and things like that. And it's, in part, I feel like the, answer my own question here is in part it's the long-term cycle of an advanced economy moving from manufacturing to services. And so that's just part of it. That's where the weight in the economy is. The balance has sort of shifted more to, software and internet, those kinds of companies. But the sort of convergence part of it, I thought was really interesting. You said because I sort of think of some of these technologies become a sort of product of their own. It's like, oh, well, we're a computer company. We make computers. And then with computerization, the 20th century, computerization starts catching on, and a bunch of other big companies that do completely other things start saying, oh, well, maybe we should start using some of these supercomputing applications for our work too. We can run payroll with them and do it else. And so they say, oh, well, we're innovative. Well, we're a computer company now too. It's like, well, I mean, in that sense, every company's a computer company because everyone has a PC on their desk. And so that's sort of like the ultimate version of that. And I feel like even in like the business, I'll get to this in a minute, but in the sort of business case for AI applications, every company is saying now, in every prospectus, every quarterly earnings call, they're like, oh, well, we're an AI company now too because we do it. It's like, well, yeah, we're all an electricity company because we all have lights, but at a certain point, a technology gets so dispersed that it's not really a differentiator.
Well, that's exactly right. And clearly it's become a bit of a buzzword. And, this has led to some critics saying that there's a lot of so-called, AI snake oil out there, that a lot of companies are trying to sell us things that they don't really have to deliver. And I fear there is some truth to that. This happened. I remember this distinctly happening 25 years ago, where all of a sudden the internet came along and everybody was an internet company, right? Even though they really weren't. And they tried to integrate in digital technologies and e-commerce capabilities and internet technologies, but some did it better than others. But not all of them were really quote unquote internet companies, just as not everybody's an AI company today. That being said, much as those previous technologies, digital technologies, internet capabilities, broadband, so on and so forth, sort of infused all sorts of old businesses and sectors and professions. The same is happening with AI, but just to varying degrees, right? And so there are only really so many companies that are pure play AI companies. In reality, there's many other companies that are utilizing AI at the edges to change their business model. It's funny you mentioned electricity just a second ago. Edison once said, in response to someone who was talking to him about like the field of electricity, he said, it's not a field, it's a field of fields. He said, electricity is many, many different things and segments and sectors and components. And whatever one thinks about Edison's assessment of electricity, it's certainly true that AI is a field of many fields. And it really only makes sense as we transition into a policy discussion to really talk about the specific fields and how it's like you're not just going to say AI, it's AI in medicine, AI in energy, AI in finance, AI in hiring, whatever, and then you can have a more rational discussion. And the problem with policy discussions in Washington right now is that they're operating at such a high level of abstraction that they're pretty close to meaningless. And I think a lot of policymakers are still very confused about this and calling for really crazy ideas about regulating quote unquote AI without really specifying what they mean by that or identifying how AI probably already is regulated in some of those different fields,
Mm-hmm.
and in some cases very heavily regulated.
Well, yeah, so with AI as the new hot thing, both in the business world and in the regulatory policy world, um, maybe that's a good opportunity to sort of like look back on, say, like your own career, for example. Uh, you know, so you've seen various waves of sort of regulatory enthusiasm, and over the years with all these like tech topics, you know, the sort of communications and mass media stuff, as well as the big computing stuff. So we've got Tipper Gore trying to protect children from hearing, bad heavy metal lyrics. You know, it, to today, people said, "Oh, well, there was this big shakeup on the board of OpenAI. The feds should have stepped in and somehow, messed with their corporate governance because they're such an, structurally important company about to the, future of technology." And over these, decades, that's what's 30 years, what is your kind of like big picture look at the track record? Have a lot of innovations managed to like escape getting choked off by big government, or are there a lot of like bodies on that trail where that we sort of think about what could have been if it hadn't been kind of stomped down?
Yeah, great question. I spent a lot of time in my last two books on permissionless innovation and then on evasive entrepreneurs talking about just this point, like how is it that some technologies or sectors sort of like make it through and gain escape velocity outside the regulatory morass of Washington and other capitals, and others don't. Identify two general buckets of technologies we can think about. One I call born free, and the other I call born into regulatory captivity. And it's pretty clear what those mean. I mean, the born free technologies are those that are come into existence or become more successful without any overarching body of law or agency sort of like in place in a technocratic way. Like an agency with the technology in the middle of its name does not exist. Whereas the born into regulatory captivity technologies are the ones that are unfortunate enough to come about in an environment already encumbered by a lot of regulation. So what are some common examples? Well, obviously, you think about a driverless car. A driverless car is both a new thing and an old thing, right? It's basically a computer on wheels. That's a new thing, and computers aren't regulated. We don't have a Federal Computers Commission, but we do have plenty of automobile regulation.
Mm.
And a computer on wheels is still a car. And so it's going to be more of a born into regulatory captivity technology, as we have seen happen, right? All these state and local governments trying to regulate driverless cars to varying degrees, and the federal government wondering what our framework should be to reform DOT and NHTSA regulations. to handle these new things. Same with drones. Drones came along, kind of a new thing, but it's really still an old thing. It's a flying thing, and flying things are regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. So long as there's an alphabet soup regulator with the technology in the middle of its name, you're going to be born into captivity. But every once in a while, you're lucky enough to be a technology that comes along that is born free. You're something new and novel and different. If you are in 3D printing, if you're in virtual reality, if you're in certain types of neurotechnology and some other types of things, you're kind of born free. You don't really have a clear body of law or a clear agency to technocratically manage you. It doesn't mean there's no regulation. Of course, there's common law and there's general purpose, FTC regulation, antitrust, consumer welfare stuff, consumer protection laws. But you don't have a technocratic regulation, regulatory regime, statute, and an agency. This determines so much. And really, the smart venture capitalists realized this long ago, and they've steered money in those directions in a lot of companies. You remember for the longest time, Google and Apple didn't want anything to do with healthcare because they were basically like, we don't want to deal with the FDA, and it was only very reluctantly over time they figured out a way to deal with it and come and figure out how to crack that. And now they're pretty active in those spaces. But it's been a detrimental thing in terms of entrepreneurialism, innovation, and investment that we have so many technologies that are sort of born in captivity. And AI is this interesting case study because it feels like totally new and different, but again, it's invading spaces that are already extremely heavily regulated. And it's forcing this governance moment for a whole host of older technologies that are trying to figure out how to break out of that box. And in some cases, I'm very pessimistic. I, for example, don't think the drone revolution can ever take off in this country because of the FAA. I think the FAA is probably the single most precautionary principle-oriented agency in the nation. However, I'm actually more optimistic that certain new AI and ML, machine learning enabled medical devices are actually going to break out of the regulatory box a little bit, and the FDA showing signs of being willing to work with them. So my confidence levels vary depending on circumstances, technologies, and sectors, but that distinction is really important and problematic from an entrepreneurial and an investment perspective for a nation. And it's why America is going to win some and lose some when it comes to AI innovation.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that a lot over the years from people about where, people talking about market trends or investors themselves talking about, where they think it makes sense to put money, and steering away from industries that are already heavily regulated is, a very, very common thing. They're like, well, I've got some people and, we worked on a project and, it could solve this problem, but it could take us 10 years to wade through this, legal regulatory junk. And I'm not going to, if I can attract some venture capital for a project, I want to do it where I can get a payoff, not where I have to spend all the money raised on regulatory compliance attorneys. And it's completely understandable why people would do that. But then you have, like you said, you have these possibilities. I think I was talking to Neil Chilson, another noted technology expert, and he was saying, I think it was Google said they'd uh, done something with uh, like a contact lens for your eye that could diagnose, eye problems. And someone, asked someone from the company, like, wait, whatever happened to that? They're like, oh, well, we developed it and it seemed to work, but it would be way too complicated and expensive to license it in the
Right.
medical world in the United States. So it's just sitting on the shelf somewhere.
Yeah, and we have really good examples of how this plays out globally. I mean, this has really important ramifications for global competitive advantage, right? I mean, and we can take a look at Europe. And whenever I'm lecturing to students or audiences, I always ask the question, tell me a major digital technology innovator based in Europe today. And there's just silence in the room. There's nobody raises a hand, and somebody will say, Spotify. And I'm like, okay, I'll give you Spotify, but it's pretty small potatoes compared to the bigger tech companies of the world. And, so Europe, as one magazine, the International Accounting Magazine, recently had a symposium on Europe's competitive advantage in technology. And the title of the symposium, which surveyed something like the views of 15, 16 different experts, the title of the symposium was, quote, "The Biggest Loser." A nice summation of the last 25 years of Europe and a lot of emerging tech. And this is because Europe made choices about like how to lock in a precautionary principle stance towards all sorts of existing sectors and then new ones and layered it on thick. And because we live in a world of global innovation arbitrage and innovators and their innovations move around to wherever they're treated most hospitably, it meant that America was on the winning end of that arbitrage. And it wasn't just that so many of the best and brightest in Europe came to America, not just to Silicon Valley, but everywhere in America to innovate. It's that the money followed. And now they're suffering. And of course, they're doubling down on it with a new AI Act and all sorts of digital privacy acts. They don't know how to, stop digging that hole. Well, we should learn from that. This is a really powerful real world case study. This is what economists and political scientists care about, like the screw theory. Yeah, we want to see how things play out in the real world. And in terms of technological innovation opportunities over the last 25 years, especially in the information technology space, America has been a net winner, right? We did not adopt a heavy-handed precautionary principle across the board. We have it in the narrow on some sectors, as I just identified, but on the broad-based sort of approach to technology policy in information and communications markets, we've had a lot more permissionless innovation than Europe has, although obviously not as much as the two of us would probably prefer.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the sort of like the pro-regulator side, the EU, if there was an EU bureaucrat sitting here in this call with us right now, they would say, well, our rules might have had some negative effects in terms of like the acceleration of innovation growth, but we prevented all these important harms from
Mm,
happening. So it's worth it, right? They
mm,
would argue that there's like a positive ROI to that. Say we stopped because I was at this antitrust conference is I think I've mentioned it before on the on the show several years ago, and it was actually about how left wing and right wing people in America might all both be favor of more antitrust, right? Because you got the the Trump, JD Vance, kind of people from the right, and then the populist right, and then the corporate skeptic left, and it was like, well, will this be the future that left and right will come together and be pro strong antitrust in the future? And one of the women on the panel was competition attorney. She was European, but she was then working in the UK, which was then still in the EU. And someone asked her, well, you seem to be a really big fan of EU tech regulation, but hasn't that resulted in almost no big tech companies existing in Europe? Like you don't have Google, you don't have Apple, you don't have these like really big companies. And she said, well, no, of course not. That's the point, because
mhm,
those companies are bad.
mm. Right.
This is the proof of concept. It's a
Yeah,
feature, not a bug that, well, we don't, that's why
that's
that
really
we're
unfortunate.
successful.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I'll just say this. If Europeans regulators seem to boast that like regulation is their leading digital export now. It's astonishing they would boast about that. I think most economists and political scientists agree you are not going to create lasting competitive advantage for a nation or a continent based upon red tape. It just hasn't never been done. You have to have a product. You have to have economic growth. And the key to fueling economic growth is technological innovation and a constant replenishing of it through a creative destruction process. And Europe will not allow it. Period. Full stop. That's the end of the story. I mean, their competitive advantage has been sacrificed at the altar of safetyism, and like making sure the status quo is perfectly preserved and every theoretical harm is eradicated up front. But there's no proof that they've made the world any safer or they're their consumers any better, right? I always ask them, like, tell me how much more privacy you really think you have in Europe. I mean, I don't really see it, even with GDPR and other regulations. I mean, ultimately, what gives you more safety, and my great hero, Aaron Wadolski, taught me this. Fred Smith introduced me to Aaron Wadolski back in 1991 and changed my life when I read his book, Searching for Safety. He taught us that, if you attempt to have trial without error, then you will have no progress or prosperity, right? You have to have trial and error. You have to have experimentation.
mhm.
And this is what the Europeans can't tolerate. They can't tolerate risk taking. They just will not. And so, as I pointed out in my book on permissionless innovation, the fundamental problem with the precautionary principle is that if you spend all of your time worrying about hypothetical worst case scenarios, and then you make hypothetical worst case scenarios the basis of public policy, it means that a great many best case scenarios can never come about,
Mm.
that you only get the good by understanding there'll be some failure along the way. We learn from the trials, we get some errors, but we correct for them. The Europeans want to do this all through a crystal ball up front. And the problem with that is that there's no technological Nostradamus. We can't figure this all
Mhm.
out. Sometimes you have to actually go through it and then find the sort of ex ante remedies to it. And this is what America has been better at. We haven't been perfect about it. We do have some ex ante precautionary regulations, but we understand there's enormous costs and delays and harms to them as well, right? There's trade-offs. But we luckily rely more on ex ante after the fact sort of regulations to address the harms as we see them developing. And then we rely on more competition and innovation
Mhm.
to get us to a better spot in society. That is the key to prosperity, not the precautionary principle.
Well, yeah, and it seems like the kind of very low risk tolerance here, European approaches is that what you might get is sort of the sustained mediocrity of the status quo at best.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, and but so the question about what harms are actually being avoided, if any, um, and I think probably the number one thing that most like just average internet users have experienced as a result of aggressive European style internet regulation is the GDPR cookie pop up where you have to like consent to cookies every time you load a page. Uh, which I don't, thank goodness that we all have that. We're able to take 1 second out of our day to
Right.
constantly click accept cookies, accept cookies, accept cookies on every website in the world now, thanks to GDPR. Uh, but it makes me wonder, as all of these come up, all of these sort of boogeymen of the week, this tech company is doing this thing bad, this tech company is doing that thing bad. The chair of the FTC has, a long list of, villains that need to be dealt with, most of which seem to be tech companies. How many of these tech industry complaints against the companies that is, and calls for regulation, um, are are sort of flavors of the week with no underlying harm being caused. But besides the fact that sometimes they aren't even alleging any current harm, it's just prospective. Maybe someday this bad thing will happen. When I first started doing this, all of just around generally this stuff, public policy stuff, in the summer of 1998, I was an intern, and the first thing I wrote was something about the Microsoft antitrust case, advising people that my good friend and colleague Wayne Cruz was available for interviews on the Microsoft antitrust case. And so the Justice Department wanted to have Microsoft permanently broken up. The first, this was after the summer of '98. The first judge hearing the case said, actually, yeah, yes, Microsoft should be broken up. Turns out that didn't quite happen because there were further appeals. Um, but the idea was that Microsoft was such a huge, dominant, monopolist behemoth that the only way our computer software industry in the United States and around the world could possibly be safeguarded was for Microsoft to be permanently broken up.
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
was right. That was like the minimum necessary to make sure that the economy didn't fall apart. And of course, that didn't happen. Right. There was some settlement between the federal government and Microsoft, but they certainly didn't get broken up, and there was no big systemic remedies. Yet, in all this time, what happened? Right. Well, nothing happened.
Right.
Microsoft was successful. Other tech companies were successful. The software industry is more competitive than ever. None of the doomsayer predictions about what would happen if Microsoft wasn't broken up happened. Yet
Right.
all the people who said, just like all the people who said without, the FCC regulating, content moderation, uh, all the people who said this is the end of the world were
Yeah.
wrong. But I
Right.
don't think I've heard even one of them apologize in the last 25 years.
No, no, of course not. They sweep it under the rug. 15 years ago, I wrote a study called A Brief History of Media Merger Hysteria. And I talked about examples like this. I mean, the Microsoft case is a fun one, but all the Chicken Littleism that goes around various mergers. I mean, the doozy of the mother of them all is AOL Time Warner. The hysteria over that 20 years ago was at a fever pitch. The panic about how it was going to result in gloom and doom, and there were people like Jeff Chester and other regulatory advocates going around saying it was going to be a new totalitarianism. Uh, But not to be outdone, then there was Rupert Murdoch's efforts to get DirecTV, and that was labeled the digital Death Star was going to be created. As far as I know, no rebels were killed in the making of the DirecTV merger, but and famously, Rupert Murdoch, just 2 years after acquiring DirecTV, spun it off and told the New York Times that he was tired of that quote unquote turd bird of DirecTV's satellite system. AOL Time Warner resulted in $99 billion in write-off losses within a year and 160 billion, I believe, within 2 years. And it's spiraled into oblivion just about 4 or 5 years later. I could go on down the list. I mean, there's a long history of this. And what's astonishing is that the same exact people that were making all the Chicken Little predictions of gloom and doom because of these tech companies or mergers of the past are the same ones making them today. They don't change their tune. They just change their players. It's like a Mad Libs game. They just erase one company or sector's name and they put in a new, and then they tell the same gloom and doom story and they get away with it again and again and again. And it's easy to understand why, because they can get away with it because the media loves a bad news story. Matt Ridley's written eloquently about this and talks about how quote unquote bad box office always sells and it always will. And we're trying to tell a good news story and we're expected to explain it with facts and have some shame, and we do. But we get buried on page, A32, why those people who come up with the constant Chicken Little stories get A1 coverage, right? And I know I'm dating myself by using newspaper numbers, page numbers, but that's the way the news works is, bad news sells. And so I don't know how to get away from this problem, Richard. I really don't. I identify their errors in their thinking, how the Chicken Littleism was proven wrong again and again, how we had technological disruption and change that was completely unpredicted, and yet nobody seems to care. They dig into the bad news. The whole debate about artificial intelligence today and all the innovators is just dripping with dystopian dread. It reads like the most horrifying, dystopian science fiction novel or television show imaginable. And that's dictating the way our policy works now. This is why we have extremism at the top of the agenda in our Congress with new AI agencies, licensing regime, transparency mandates, liability. And, just this week, there was an effort to railroad through a bill on the Senate floor that would have made generative AI companies liable and opened the floodgates of litigation for anything that AI systems did that were user generated. So if you and I were using Dolly right now to create some AI generated art or ChatGPT to make a story and it said something defamatory or whatever, hate speech, the law, as Josh Hawley wanted it to change, would just say like, yeah, we should be able to sue the pants off of Sam Altman and OpenAI and everybody else. Well, that's going to result in no AI, generative AI. That's going to, this is one of the biggest problems in America is we don't have control of our tort system, and we're in real trouble if the precautionary principle gets married up with dystopian minded scenarios about gloom and doom, because I don't know how we counter that. Facts and shame don't seem to matter.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I mean, I think you can look at someone's imagine a like hypothetical LinkedIn profile, and it could be like, the antitrust crusader, and you could see he's had 20 jobs over the years, and one of them was, anti-Microsoft, and then he was anti-LinkedIn, and then he was anti-Facebook, and then he was anti-Amazon, and he just kept getting promoted, right, from being anti one big company to the next. But the point you make about how this sort of preemptive AI, um, calls for regulation, in we sort of recognize this in the First Amendment world, where aggressive government action can be said to have a quote chilling effect, right, on free speech, on free
Right.
expression. So we don't like things that are explicitly violating the First Amendment, but we don't like things that even maybe stop it a little bit short because there is this negative effect and people don't feel free to
Right.
express themselves the way it should be. And I think I'm not on the inside of any of these AI development companies, but I can sort of see using as a user clearly some of the things that they have been built into the limitations have been, I think, preemptively anticipated. So if you look at a product like Midjourney, they're very strict about sort of like explicit and adult content, but to a degree that falls way short of anything that would be obscene, right?
Yeah.
And so, you have when you have vague standards, right? You don't have these rules yet, but they're sort of anticipated. And so if you're like managing risk for your company that is an AI company, you have to kind of try and anticipate them. Um, you have, this inefficient overcompliance, right? Like
Right.
even if the line was a legitimate line to say you can do this and you can't do that, you have to over comply to a little bit. Otherwise, you'll be falling over the line. So, um, so we have this sort of preemptive overcompliance with anything they think might be threatening. I don't know. If you look at Bing, they do great trademark characters. They do trademark logos. They do corporate logos. Midjourney doesn't do that.
Right.
They're great at something that's very similar, but
Right.
something that's trademarked, it becomes very obvious they're not doing it. So there's things like that that are I'm just sort of intuiting, but we can all understand the dynamics about why if you were developing this tool, you'd be like, well, who knows, 3 months, 6 months, 2 months, 5 years down the road, we don't want to build our software in a way that we need to like take a hacksaw to 2 years from now. So we're going to kind of hold back and limit what our users can do
Right.
because we know those regulators are sort of hovering, that they've tied the sort of Damocles over us already.
Well, you made a couple of really important points here, Richard. Let's unpack them. First of all, yes, many leading generative AI developers today are being hyper cautious about their policies, and they've got best practices and user agreements in place that are in some cases quite restrictive. And for many users go too far, right? There's been a lot of complaints. Look at the complaints about like Twitter before Elon Musk took it over. People were like, oh my gosh, they're trying to censor all these things and speech. And our approach to that should be like, well, fine, that's their patch of the communications wood. Let them run it how they wish, and we can go somewhere else and choose a different platform. And that's hopefully the approach we take here as well. The problem is this. The problem is that lurking in the background is the threat of liability on one hand in the courts, and then the threat from the regulators and the policymakers on the other. And what the policymakers and regulators are doing to AI is what they did traditionally to communications, precisely because of something else you mentioned, the First Amendment. In the old days, the Federal Communications Commission knew that even though they were licensing broadcast television and radio operators, that they had some limits imposed on them by law because of the First Amendment. And the First Amendment has a very clear overarching directive of no prior restraint, right? It essentially treats speech as innocent until proven guilty. That is the gold standard in America. It's the best thing we've got in the Constitution. And it has been a great thing in the world of communications policy. But it hasn't ended up holding the line on a lot of regulatory mischief because the regulators and the policymakers got smart and engaged in what came to be known as regulation by raised eyebrow and basically used intimidation tactics, jawboning, and indirect threats, saying, well, you got a little license there. Wouldn't want to see that revoked. Or, oh, hey, you got a little merge you're going through there. I'd be ashamed if it didn't get approved. So here's what you can do for us. And it's like a deal you can't refuse. It's
Mm.
mafioso tactics, right? And this is how communications policy basically came to incorporate a sensorial element without having formal censorship. And this is the great danger now in the algorithmic age, is that in the name of algorithmic fairness, quote unquote, or algorithmic justice or ethics, we're going to have a lot of companies behaving extraordinarily cautiously, but not because it's the right thing to do for their customers or the public, but because they're scared, to death of liability or specifically regulatory backlash or political backlash. So even if we don't get any federal AI legislation next year, this session of Congress, and I don't think we will, you're going to see a lot of meddling, a lot of job owning. And this problem is going to become a chronic one because every regulator now is being empowered by Joe Biden to go out and do this under his new 111-page executive order for AI, saying, hey, go investigate all the ways that algorithms are biased and discriminatory and unfair and eradicate that, root out that problem. You've got a lot of powers to do it. And you know what? He's probably right because the administrative state is massive. 434 departments in our federal government, 2.2 million civilian workers in them, plenty of technocrats running around who can make life miserable for innovators in this country. And so the threat to algorithmic innovation and free speech in this country is not necessarily a direct frontal assault. It's the indirect back doorways of meddling and making life miserable. And one final phrase you used that I'll use here, sword of Damocles. It's the fact that the sword hangs over the neck that matters. It doesn't need to fall. It just needs to hang.
Mhm.
And when it hangs in the room ominously in the form of like, holy crap, there's a lot of regulation that could come or a lot of liability that could hit us, you bend and then you break. And this is exactly what's going to happen in the world of AI as the culture warriors and the other meddling technocrats come after AI in coming years.
Yeah, and the one other thing that you said about this I think was really interesting that I think applies in some of these other regulatory debates as well is that a lot of the emotional energy right now, I think it is highly emotive, emotional energy for, AI regulation seems to be coming from worries about worst case scenarios. And, so we need AI, specifically in the case of AI, we need development so that super smart artificial intelligence doesn't turn on us and create a Terminator style war for survival. Um, but that scary premise is itself a scary premise, I would say, to regulate on, because if the harms you're protecting against are the catastrophic extinction of humankind, then that theoretically opens you up to any potential remedy.
Right,
No remedy could be overreach if the
right.
alternative that you're saving us from is extinction of the human species. So
Yep.
that it sort of creates these sort of wildly high stakes where any action by the government seems reasonable by comparison if we're assuming that's the alternative, right?
That's exactly right. And, unfortunately, this is where policy's at right now. And we got dangerously close with the UK government having its AI summit a few months back of having like sort of like an international accord preemptively shoved down our throats. But luckily, a lot of people pushed back quietly behind the scenes to say, look, most of these risks, they're just hypothetical and there's no way you can prove these things. And if you're making, again, go back to the point I made earlier that I make in my work, if you're making that the baseline of all public policy, then you're freezing progress in place. You're basically saying no progress. It's essentially a degrowth philosophy coming to the world of technological innovation, saying stop growing, stop innovating for any host of reasons, right? And that is stasis and the death of progress and prosperity as a civilization. And we can absolutely not allow that sort of war on computation to take place and to decimate this next technological revolution. But unfortunately, that is currently driving the debate. I mean, in the halls of Congress and the halls of the EU and the UN and elsewhere, and it conditions the ground so that even if we don't get that most sweeping, control, we get something pretty sweeping that's almost just as bad because it can eliminate the entire sector and discourage innovation by treating algorithmic innovation as guilty until proven innocent. And that presumption is what is at the core of the future of all technology policy. This question: are we going to apply the standard we want for our criminal justice system more broadly, as we should? We should say you're innocent until proven guilty. And if these harms manifest themselves, we have a lot of remedies. We have a lot of different approaches to it. But if you're arguing that it's the end times, that is an apocalyptic kind of scenario, like then what that counsels is a complete cessation of any innovative activities within computational algorithmic spaces, and that is horrific. I mean, this is why I've argued that of all these technology policy issues I've done, this is the single most important and concerning moment in modern technological history. Is like, what are we going to do about AI and computational technologies? Because the first generation, we kind of won, right? I mean, we did not get a Federal Computer Commission or a Federal Consumer Electronics Commission or a Federal Internet Agency. We allowed it to prosper. We treated it as innocent until proven guilty, gave it innovators the green flag. That needs to continue to be the basis of our innovation culture as a nation. And I'm hoping that technology can kind of plod forward and the so-called pacing problem, the fact that technology evolves faster than law, will continue. And because one man's pacing problem is another man's pacing benefit, as I like to say.
Mhm.
And I'm hopeful that, if nothing else, provides the check on government overreach and stupidity. And I also, people say, well, then you're an anarchist. You don't believe in anything. Like, again, no. I've written extensively about all the tools our federal government already has to regulate algorithmic harms. And so we have to address these criticisms in a responsible way. There's many people in the AI world who are so-called accelerationists, or like, let it all rip, man. Anything goes. It's awesome. I'm sort of with him to a point, but not all the way to the end of that argument, because we do need to understand there will be risks and will be harms. We need to identify how we can correct for them after the fact and make the public more comfortable and policymakers more comfortable with the idea that we should allow that innovation go forward, but indeed seek remedies to where problems do develop. And that's the more rational, level-headed, moderate approach to AI policy that I think is sorely missing in today's debate.
Well, yeah, and I think that that is sort of the details are important, but the general orientation, I think, is what the general public is going to like pick up on instead of the stop the world, I want to get off, freeze everything in place. I call for a complete stop of AI until we can figure out what the heck's going on attitude. The sort of techno optimist view that I got from previous guest Jim Pethokoukis, who just has a new book out about futurism and how we can have an optimistic sort of culture of innovation and growth in the United States again. So it's leaving me optimistic, Adam. Maybe without intending to. Maybe we're in a good place. Well, this has been an excellent conversation, and thank you so much for being with us. Before we go, where can people find you on this technological utopia known as the internet?
Well, they can come to the R Street Institute website and find a lot of my publications there. I also blog at an old tech blog called the Technology Liberation Front, and I have a Medium page under my own name. And you can find me at that thing that used to be called Twitter, but is now called X, at just at Adam Thierer, and you'll find me ranting on a daily basis back against the Chicken Little crowd and trying to put them in their place. But Richard, thank you so much for having me today. I really enjoy your show.